Hi, I'm Darryl and I'm trying to be a maker, and in this video I'm going to make the first sculpt on this channel, and it's going to be this little guy, Pachycephalosaurs. So why not follow along with me and let's see how I do. Okay, so to make this sculpt, first thing we need is an armature. I'm going to be using this wood disc as the base, and I will be making the armature out of aluminium wire and kitchen foil. I'll be using this as a guide for the length of wire runs. Okay, here goes nothing. So I'm using my character sketches as reference for the armature. This will be a common thread throughout the sculpting process going forward. I've made an extra mini armature here for the terrain that the tree and the dino are going to be standing on. I've covered the base in tin foil so that I can remove the terrain easily to paint in the future. I'm prepping the clay now. I'm using Sculpey, which is a polymer clay. You have to cure it by oven baking it. It doesn't air dry. It's quite hard at room temperature, so you have to knead it to make it pliable. And the pasta roller just helps speed that process up. And now I'm going to add a base layer of clay to the terrain, the tree stump, and the dino. By blocking out everything to a level now, I get a good idea of how the parts are going to fit together in the finished sculpt. Okay, now to add some detail to the base. It's basically just soil, so I'm using a tinfoil ball to roll some fine detail into the surface. The cling film stops the detail from being too harsh. I'll then roll out some small balls of different sizes to push into the surface to add some variety. These balls will be like little clods or stones. I'm using a heat gun here to bake the clay balls. I wouldn't recommend this normally, but they're really small. None of them are bigger than 2 millimeters. And I only really need them to hold their shape while I push them into the soil. Okay, now that the clods are pressed into the base, it's ready to bake. It's going to go into the oven at 130 degrees centigrade for around 30 minutes. The thickest part of the base isn't bigger than 1 centimeter, so that should be plenty of time. Through the magic of editing, all baked. I'm happy with it for the most part. Really happy to see that there are no cracks. It looks like it's baked really evenly. There is a depression running along here where the armature wire is. I have no idea why that happened. And I guess there might have been an air pocket along the wire, and as the clay's baked, it shrunk down. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not too worried about it for now though. The base being baked and solid means that I can work on the shape of the tree now, and I'll hopefully be adding more clay to the base later, at which point I'll be able to hide that depression. So now that the base is baked, we can work on the shape of the trunk without worrying about the base getting misshapen. While building the shape up, I'm always thinking about the sculpt as a whole, and at this point decided that the stump needed to be shorter so that it doesn't overshadow the dino. With the base shape of the stump defined, it's time for detailing. Working on the break area, I've added 3 levels of detail. The first layer is very stylized, just suggesting wood grain. The second layer is starting to show a bit of a break, and it gives the damaged area some depth. And the final top layer is really where all the work goes, adding the splintered bark and the cracks moving out from the break. And now I have to decide on the bark texture for the stump. First option I tried was a bit more realistic texture, but I decided that with its scale it was a bit too busy and distracted from the break. So I tried something similar with a bigger scale. Unfortunately, I just decided that that scale just wasn't going to work for the sculpt as a whole. So finally, I just decided to settle on this stylized option, just pushing the back of the sculpting tool into the clay, which I decided was the best. And so, with the bark and the wood rings added to the top of the stump, it's done, and it's time to move on to the dino. I just took a moment here to decide how best to get started on the dino, remembering to take into account that all-important reference. Deciding to start with the leg, I draw an outline of where I want the thigh to meet the torso, and then start adding clay to bulk the leg up. Always keeping the muscle structure under the skin in mind when deciding where to add the clay and how much clay to add. Eventually work my way down to the foot and the tricky task of adding the toes. First adding balls to the foot and blending them on as the first toe segment. Then pushing short lengths of wire into the clay to hold the end of the toe in place and shape it. With the size of the foot now more clearly defined, I go back up the leg and add some more shape to it. I repeat this step on the other leg as well before moving on to the body. The first thing I'll do on the body is draw a line along the back where I think the spine should flow. I'm thinking about the flow from the tail all the way along the spine and up the neck. Having that center line there helps when I'm bulking up the body and deciding where to put the clay. I'm adding clay to the body, bulking it up, and giving the back a nice curve. Then I move up the body to define the shoulders. The arm was really tricky to do. I should have added a finer gauge to my armature for the arm. The arm was just a single line of wire, and it just meant that the clay kept twisting far too easily on it. Something to remember for next time. Once the arms are fleshed out a bit, I start to work on the hands, first making the palms. I roll 2 balls and a tube to make the basic palm shape, and then blend the 3 shapes together. I make 2 palms for left and right hand. Now I roll a long tube of clay to cut out equal lengths for the fingers. By cutting all the fingers off of one tube of clay, it helps keep the consistency across all of them. I blend the fingers of the first hand, which again at this scale was a serious challenge. Took me a while. And then start adding small tubes down the back of the hand to suggest tendons. All of which is repeated on the second hand, except that this one is a half-closed fist. Before adding the hands to the body, I need to finalize it a bit more. While looking at it and referencing my sketches, I realize that the neck is way too long and I need to cut it down. It's moments like this that make me really hesitant to pre-bake the body. While it would help to handle the sculpt and adds clay to it, I just don't feel confident or experienced enough yet to know when to do that early bake. Anyway, once the neck's trimmed down and repositioned, it's time to get started on the head. I bake these eyeballs off camera. Because my dino has big eyes, I'm going to place them in early and build this clay up around them. First cutting the clay away to recess the eyeball. Any minute now, I'll remember I can still remove the head and make my life easier. I keep building up around the eyes just to hold them in place. Then I'll start adding clay to bulk up the head to get closer to its final size. At this point, I've got the fleshy parts of the head to a good point, so I'll start adding the bone dome. Starting by marking where I want the recess in the head to be. At this rough stage, I really am being a little bit too precise before starting to carve away the excess clay. I think I need to be a little less pedantic so early on in the process if I want to become a faster sculptor. Anyway, I eventually get the dome on and then trim it down to a size I'm happy with. And here it is in place. A little more definition on the brows as well. Next, I start working on making the beak and fitting it to the head. Okay, I need to pause here for a minute and explain something. So I grew up with an animated show called Dino Riders. I remember it being pretty awesome. I mean, it had dinosaurs with frickin' laser beams on their head. And of course, later, Jurassic Park. So while I do acknowledge the fact that some/many dinosaur species did have feathers, in my mind, dinosaurs are still very much Jurassic Park era dinos, basically armor-plated rhinos. So why am I looking at what can only be described as a bird head? And yeah, I know it's the beak, and the head was far from done at this point, but it still bugged me, even as I posed the mouth and angled the jaw, or added the jaw membranes. So I took a break from the head and made a tongue. And then, still ignoring the head, I went back to defining the body a bit more, refining the transition from the tail to the torso, adding armor plating over the limbs, kind of like an Asian armored rhino. Then, smoothing and detailing the legs. And now, it's finally time for the hands to become one with the body. So I cut some thin wire supports and attach them to the arms. Video Me has decided at this point that it's a good time for a status update. And I agree. I can only put the head off for so long, so back to it. I start by adding some detail to the beak, but then decide that to make the changes I need to the rest of the face, I should bake the beak first so it doesn't deform while I'm working around it. So I remove the beak. And if I'm going to bake the beak, why not add the tongue and a few claws to bake as well? Now this is a juvenile dino, so the claws are stubby rather than being long and pointy. In go the toe claws, followed magically by the finger claws. Then off to bake for 30 minutes. I add the baked beak back into the head, a bit more recessed than before. Then give the eyes more lids and define and detail the brows, eye sockets and cheekbones. Now add some detail to the bone dome. At this point, I'm feeling happier with the head, but it's still missing something. And that something is horns. Lots of stubby little ones, which if I'd thought ahead, I would have baked with the claws and beak. I add the now baked horns by making a hole for the horn to rest in and then adding a ring of clay around the horn to blend into the head. Then just repeat until you feel you've got enough coverage of horns and you're done. So, horns, check. Beak, check. Just the claws to go. These go in similar to the horns, except I had the armature wire and the toes to contend with. But in the end, I got all the toe and finger claws done. Now, a final push, adding a bit more body detail, starting with some spine ridges for the back. Then adding some detail to the body armor plate edges. And a once over on the head detail, including adding a circular crack to the dome, indicating impact damage. But don't worry, he's a young juvenile, still growing, so he'll be fine. He's just going to have an awesome scar and story to tell. Okay, so with the sculpting on the dino mostly done, I give it a brush with isopropyl alcohol to try and smooth any fingerprints and clean the surface in general. Deciding I may knock the bottle over, I get a small plastic container to put the alcohol in. And almost immediately find out that this particular plastic doesn't play nice with the alcohol. Oh well, back to the bottle. Of course, after all of that, it makes perfect sense to reapply the fingerprints while finally attaching the head to the body. And now, after staring at it for a bit, the dino can get a bake. So, it would be around this point that the pros would have had a really cool transition effect from the unbaked to the baked sculpt. But I'm not a pro, and I only thought of that while this was baking. Another problem is that you, as a pro, know what the result is going to be, so that when you do the funky transition, you end up going from an unbaked sculpt to a well-baked sculpt. On one hand, I'm really happy with how this turned out. There's no cracks. Yeah, it baked really well. I'm super stoked. But on the other hand, I'm holding a hand. So basically what happened was, as it baked, the sculpt keeled over and snapped the hand off as it pressed into the base. Now, I know armatures are supposed to carry the weight, and I know that having a single point armature is always a bit of a risk, but I just assumed that that was more about the sculpting weight, like while you're working with it and holding the clay. I didn't think about, if I'm honest, I didn't think about the baking process and the fact that the Sculpey will shrink a little and shift under baking. So yeah, lesson learned. And now we'll just figure out the best way to fix it. I'm not too concerned. I'm just going to use some CA glue. I know there are sculpting products out there that you bake and you can stick pieces together, but in this case, I think the glue will work. And to be honest, I don't have any of those products. So yeah, we're just going to carry on. Okay, so finalizing the base. I'm moving the mounting hole for the dino so that it doesn't feel so cramped up against the tree. After patching the old hole, I place the dino in its new spot and sculpt in some fingerprint detail. Then roll over the fresh clay with the same tinfoil ball I used before for detailing to match the rest of the base. I make sure not to damage the footprint here. With the base detail done, I sculpt a few leaves, which will be scattered around the base of the tree at final assembly. And now the base gets one more bake. With everything baked, I'm going to airbrush some primer onto all the pieces. It's all primed now. I'm going to put it back together, just do a dry fit, and that'll be it for this video. This video was focused just on the sculpting side. I'll be painting it in the next video. So yeah, the dry fit will be the end, and then we'll do some beauty shots. But while I'm putting this together, I thought I'd just talk about how I feel it went, what could have been better, worse. Yeah, let's get on with it. Okay, so the base ended up working quite well. I'm happy that it took multiple layers and they bound well and they didn't crack. And yeah, I could add to it as I went. Let's get this in. There we go. It actually sits on there quite nicely, which I'm glad about. Yeah, the tree, well, I'm happy with my choices in the end. Trying to decide what to do for the bark texture. Yeah, I could have been a bit more decisive and quicker with that, but in the end, it's not bad. It's not supposed to be. This is not a nature study. It's just my take on a Pachycephalosaurus. So it didn't need to be a hyper realistic tree. It was never something I was shooting for. So yeah, I think it works. We'll see after paint treatment. But yeah, for now, I think it works. As for the Pachycephalosaurus, Yeah, I like him. I like him quite a lot. I learned a lot, both with the base and with the Pachycephalosaurus, about baking Sculpey and what works, what doesn't work, shrinking. So yeah, first proper full body sculpt lessons learned to take on. But in the end, I could have been faster. I would have liked to put a bit more tertiary detail onto him, but I had to finish it at some point, and I decided to call it where it was. I think it's a nice piece anyway. I think it looks good. Definitely, definitely a successful first piece in my humble opinion, and I'm very critical of myself. So yeah. So yeah, and then I've got a bunch of these leaves that I will be putting onto the base. Obviously, if you think about something hitting a tree, there should be some foliage like just scattered on the landscape around the tree, and also a few shards of bark that I will be placing after I paint it. So I'll paint it. I just figured it would be easier to paint the pieces individually and then glue them in position. So yeah, that will be, I'll be adding that to the end. I'll be adding that to the next video. So yeah, and then from a filming point of view, how can I make that better? Well, I haven't really looked at all the footage yet. So from a camera perspective and from a me perspective, I can't really say too much. But from a setup, I definitely, when I'm sculpting and it's up close work and there's a lot of detail, and I definitely need more light. So that'll be something I'll be addressing in the next video for sure, especially for the painting side of things. And then going forward, just have more light in my work area. This isn't terrible for filming and for talking, but when you're trying to do work and stuff, yeah, I just definitely need more light. But all said and done, I'm really happy with him. So let's get some close-ups and call this one done.